All right. Much like I did at the beginning of this Vietnam unit, I want to do a short slideshow on how the U.S. decreased our involvement and conducted an exit strategy to get out of the Vietnam War. Um, Up to 1968, America's involvement, dating back to the 1940s, was kind of always increasing and escalating. We were taking on more responsibility and sending more troops into Vietnam. But it's important to see 1968 as the turning point in the war. From 1968 on, the conversation um, in Vietnam stops being about how can America defeat communism um, or protect South Vietnam, but more how can we achieve an honorable peace. Um, it becomes a conversation about how can we get out of this situation and still save some of our goals or some of our objectives or some of our lives, um, and not face a total dishonorable defeat. The turning point was really signified by something called the Tet Offensive. Tet is a Vietnamese holiday. I believe it's the celebration of the Vietnamese New Year. Um, and it was a time when America and the South Vietnamese troops weren't expecting an attack. But sure enough, a surprise attack by North Vietnamese soldiers and the insurgent group called the Viet Cong took place all across South Vietnam. If you look at this map over here to the side, you can see a bunch of different cities kind of labeled all throughout. The Tet Offensive was really a series of surprise attacks that took place in multiple places around South Vietnam. Technically, the United States and the South Vietnamese were able to fight back and claim victory in the battles. But this Tet Offensive really changed public perception and morale for the American public and for the troops. Up to Tet, the belief was that victory was always just around the corner. And if you remember that cartoon we looked at, there was no substitute for victory. But when the Tet Offensive took place, Americans and American troops realized the war was far from over and the end was not in sight. As a result, Lyndon Johnson is going to decide not to run for reelection in 1968. It's the only time where we've had a president voluntarily choose not to run while we were engaged in a war. And so, really, Lyndon Johnson is just kind of confessing he has no answers, and he was just overwhelmed by the war. In the closing months of Lyndon Johnson's presidency, protesters protesters would gather outside the White House and they would say, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Referencing the numbers of troops that were being sent to the Vietnam War. And I think that the toll of not having clear answers and the cost of the war wore Lyndon Johnson down. As a result, Richard Nixon will become president in 1968. He's a Republican, and it's his job to try to resolve this conflict in an honorable way and peacefully and achieve peace for the United States. The other reason 1968 is really a turning point is because the anti-war protest has increased so much. Bobby Kennedy, if you watched the video the other day, he was going to run for president as an anti-war candidate. Unfortunately and tragically, he was assassinated. But his message of anti-war and peace certainly caught hold with young people and college campuses. There were anti-war protests, and in many instances, several colleges had to shut down because of how strong the anti-war movement was picking up. The things I need you to know about Richard Nixon is kind of the dual nature, kind of the two-sidedness of what Nixon tried to do in Vietnam. Officially, Nixon's plan was known as Vietnamization. And from 1969 forward, he is going to gradually bring troops home. If you remember, under Lyndon Johnson, America had sent up to 500,000 troops into South Vietnam. That is the peak of our troop involvement. And during Nixon's years, we will gradually be reducing our troop levels and bringing soldiers home. But this is gradual and it takes time. Nixon comes into office in 1969, and the Vietnam War won't be over until just into his second term in 1973. Um, Vietnamization not only gradually brought U.S. troops home, but we also handed over supplies, intelligence, and really responsibility for the war back to the South Vietnamese. In other words, we weren't conceding defeat and just allowing South Vietnam to become communist right away. The idea is that the South Vietnamese would continue to conduct the war, but using our supplies or our intelligence or really our leadership, just not our troops. On a broader sense, this is known as the Nixon Doctrine. Vietnamization is what we would specifically say for the Vietnam War, but big picture, the Nixon Doctrine says, hey, you know what? America is still committed to containment. We're still going to support our allies around the world, especially in Asia. We're just not going to fight wars for them. And so Vietnamization is kind of a smaller idea or a more specific idea of this broader Nixon doctrine that America needs to stop fighting wars for other countries like we had maybe in Korea and Vietnam, and instead go back to supporting containment through other means, money, support, or diplomacy. Now, the dual side of this, the dual nature of Nixon's Vietnamization, while publicly and explicitly he was de escalating the war and bringing troops home, deep down there was an aspect where Nixon still wanted to win. He didn't want to be the first president to lose a war. And if there was a way to maybe achieve victory behind the scenes, Nixon didn't write that off. He kept that option open. Where this was really seen was in 1970 in Cambodia. Um, this dark line here on the map that runs out of North Vietnam, it runs through the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia, and then it enters back into South Vietnam. This is known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And many U.S. experts believe the reason we couldn't achieve victory was because the North Vietnamese army was always able to resupply and reinvigorate the war effort in South Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In 1970, Nixon felt like he had an opportunity to send troops into Cambodia to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail and maybe once and for all achieve victory. Um, the problem was, publicly, he was de escalating and saying Vietnamization. The invasion of Cambodia in 1970 is seen as hypocritical, is seen as enlarging or broadening the war when he was supposedly reducing it. There were massive public protests after Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia. The anti war discussion board post you did the other day on the Kent State shooting kind of got to the heart of that. The protest at Kent State was a response to the invasion of Cambodia, and it tragically ended in 4 students losing their lives. Um, so Nixon had a hard time. His goal was always an honorable peace. But yet, if he could still find a way to win the war, all the way up to 1973, he was still looking for that possible outlet. And it fueled the anti war movement that the war lingered on for so long. However, you do want to know the end of the war. By January of 1973, there's an event known as the Paris Peace Conference, or the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. And in 1973, America agrees to finally withdraw our last troops, and our armistice is settled on at the 17th parallel. Much like the split of Korea, Vietnam was going to remain divided. However, that division won't last long, and eventually South Vietnam will be united back to the North as a communist state. This final slide deals with what I'm calling the legacy of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is a very divisive war in terms of public opinion. Nixon always maintained that there was a silent majority, that the majority of Americans supported America's efforts to prevent communism and to do so through combat troops in Vietnam. Um, Yet the anti war movement, and on this slide they're labeled as radicals, did seem by the end of the war to have the louder voice. And the legacy of the Vietnam War to this day is still controversial and divided about whether it was the right war um, at the right time and in the right place. Um, Another legacy of the Vietnam War was a decreasing trust in government leaders. There was something known as a credibility gap. Can America trust our leaders in what they're telling us about foreign affairs and world affairs? All throughout the Vietnam War, there seemed to be an aspect that um, that the government was saying one thing, but the reality of the war was another. So, for example, in the 1970s, some confidential government documents were released, known as the Pentagon Papers. And these showed that what Lyndon Johnson and John F. Kennedy had said publicly about the beginning of the war was not exactly true. And some of the truth behind the USS Maddox incident and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and America's support for Ngo Dinh Diem all came to light. And Americans and the American public wondered if we could really trust our government. As a result, there were certain limits placed upon governmental power. The War Powers Resolution was an act of Congress in 1975 that is meant to limit the president's ability to wage war without a declaration of war. We talked about how in the Vietnam War there was never an official U.S. declaration of war, there was just the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The War Powers Resolution is meant to limit a president's ability to fight war without a congressional declaration. The sad part of the War Powers Resolution is that every U.S. president since Nixon has violated the War Powers Resolution. So it's meant to limit our government leaders, but no president has obeyed or abided by it. And then finally, the 26th Amendment. The 26th Amendment comes out of the Vietnam War. The 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. One of the tragedies of the Vietnam War is that 18 and 19-year-old Americans were being sent to fight a war, and yet those 18 and 19-year-olds weren't able to vote for president or vote for their elected leaders in the federal government. And this was seen as an abuse of power, that the federal government could send somebody to war without that person kind of having a consent in or to be able to participate in that aspect of American democracy. Um, so finally, I'll just end with this. The Vietnam War is a microcosm of the Cold War. It is a step back for America as a global power. It is not. Uh, it is not the end of the story when it comes to the Cold War, and in some senses, America's role as a superpower will continue even after Vietnam. The domino theory proves not to be true in the sense that after Vietnam, more countries don't continue to fall to communism. America does continue to support democratic and free allies around the world through the Nixon Doctrine and the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan Doctrine. Um, so America does not completely give up and lose its place as a global power after Vietnam, but it was an honest and kind of brutal symbol of maybe the limits of what America could do and when they could do it. This picture will be the last thing I'll mention. In 1975, 2 years after the war's over for America and Americans have gone home, the Viet Cong finally takes over South Vietnam. Americans and other South Vietnamese residents are forced to evacuate the U.S. Embassy in Saigon by helicopter. And this is kind of a harrowing image of Americans kind of clamoring to get aboard that chopper to escape the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese communists. All right, I'll stop that there. This slideshow will be included in the lecture notes. Hope this kind of wraps up our discussion of Vietnam, and please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.